Another important theory to understand work motivation is equity theory that was proposed by Adams in 1965. And this theory suggests that workers are motivated to reduce inequities that they perceive between what they put into the work and what they get out of the work. Now, the outcomes that people look at are those things we might expect to receive from a job, like pay or recognition or other forms of compensation. And inputs are those things that a worker invests in a job, such as their experience or effort or education or creativity or other things. And what Adam said is we don't stop there. What we do is make a relative judgment. We compare ourselves to comparable others in a similar role to us. And we look at what they get out of their jobs and what they put into their jobs. And now, if it's similar, if what we put into our jobs and what we get out is similar to that ratio that we observe in comparable others, then we perceive equity and we are at peace. Adams suggested that workers are motivated to reduce inequity. So we've got to examine what inequity looks like. And inequity is when you look at the outcomes that you're getting yourself and compared to what you're putting in and those inputs, and when it's less than what others are getting out of their job compared to what they're putting in. And so when we perceive that, according to Adams, we try to increase our outcomes in some manner. We say, hey, I need more. Or if we can't manage to do that, we might find ways to decrease our inputs, like decreasing effort. If we can't manage that, we can leave the situation and go to a place where we can expect to receive pay and compensation that's comparable to what others are getting. But of course, we have another way of reacting, and that's to rationalize. We might, for instance, devalue the inputs that we have and use that as an explanation for why we're not necessarily receiving what we see others receiving. And that may be through that form of rationalization a way for us to move back towards a perception of equity. According to Adams, there can be situations where we perceive overpayment inequity, that we're getting more than others that are comparable to us. Again, looking at what we're getting out of our works ourselves and versus what we're putting in, and seeing that that's more than what others are getting out of their work compared to what they're putting in. And so, again, Adam suggested that when we perceive this, there is a form of dissonance that we want to resolve to get back to a sense of balance and fairness and equity. And so we can do this by perhaps reducing the outcomes. Perhaps there are discretionary perks that we don't take because we might think not justified, or it keeps things more fair. Or we might increase our inputs. We might increase our effort to try and justify the outcomes that we're getting. Or again, we can always rationalize, and we might, for instance, look at our inputs, what we put in, and see that it has a distinctive value that might be greater than we first thought. So again, if we look at this, we can see that there's two main approaches to restoring equity when we perceive that there's underpayment or overpayment. One is behavioral. For instance, we can increase or decrease effort, or another is cognitive. We can rationalize in any number of ways to change our perception of the situation. Of course, there's a number of strengths to equity theory, and one is that it kind of hones in on motivational processes, the thought processes, the connections between our perceptions and our behaviors. And so it adds that kind of nuance that describes motivation in a way that's different than other theories. And It seems to really fit in terms of compensation situations, particularly if we think about things like salary compression. We can clearly examine that in the lens of equity theory. And it is what we would consider a foundational theory, as we will go on and talk about other aspects of fairness. Equity theory is closely connected, particularly to distributive justice or distributive fairness. And so it's important to understand for how it contributes to other theories too. Of course, there are some weaknesses, as there are with all theories. And if we look at the research that's been done on equity theory, a lot of it's fairly old, and a lot of it was done in laboratory settings, not really applied settings. There's also really issues of individual differences, that these perceptions that people have of inputs and outcomes can really vary based on individual differences. And that's not really accounted for in the theory proposed by Adams. And it may be difficult again for us to tell who a comparison person really is. And again, who my boss might think my comparison person should be might be different than who I think my comparison person should be. And that might also affect my perceptions and make them different than my boss's. All in all, though, I think that the strengths of the theory outweigh its problems, and it's a useful theory to understand how people examine the fairness of the distribution of resources in an organization.